Hey guys, welcome back to the Japan Archives. We're on episode 44 now, and this is our official first episode of year 2. Oh, we're a little podcast where we do the histories, the myths, and the legends of Japan, and we endeavor to do a poem or two along the way. I'm your host, Thomas.
I'm your co-host, Heather.
This is our first episode of year 2. Like we said, last week we said we were going to start with an ode to Basho. We are pushing that back 1 week for you guys. There's a lot about him, obviously, and we want to do a little bit of justice to him. We want to do that little bit of extra research to round it all out for you. So we were thinking that for our very first episode of year 2, we would do the next part of our Shinto mythologies we've been working through. After all, the first episode of year 1 was also Shinto, so why not start off year 2 the same way? We are fortunate, though, that though we have pushed Basho back for you, and we apologize, Heather has found a good poem by our lovely friend Basho to tide you over before next week.
So we're following in the spirit of we said we would do Basho for our first episode back. So we are doing Basho from a certain point of view.
I also want to say, just before we start this one, congratulations to you and to us, Heather. We finally hit 100 listeners for our show this week. So again, not a bad start for our start of year 2.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. But we should jump into the episode. We've done a few of these now, but I think, as ever, I'm going to ask Heather, do you remember where we left the story off last time?
They finally kicked him out of heaven, right? Like he had like killed a couple people, I think, and eaten food and done all kinds of just really mischievous and not great things. They finally just said, yeah, out, get out, leave. I think he was at the point he had been kicked out, correct?
Yeah, so we left it on a bit of a cliffhanger in that he was expelled from heaven after he had caused his sister to run away into the rock cave and the world had fallen into darkness.
That's right. That's right.
Jumping back into it then for you and for everyone else, the next part of the story. Like we said, Susano-o is finally ready to leave heaven. He has caused enough offense. You know, like we said, he caused the sun goddess to run away for a time. And generally, he has proven himself to be, oh dear, not a very nice person. So he's now living in exile, I suppose, for all his misdemeanors. And after leaving heaven, he makes his way to a river known as Hi in the province of Izumo. Again, I'm just going to say here, this is one of those things where depending on the version you read, depends on where he goes. And especially also depends on the river that he ends up as. But it doesn't seem to affect the story too much, so I just went with this one for now. Now, when he arrives here, he begins to hear weeping in the distance. And this does pique his interest, and so he decides to venture forth to try and find the source of the distress that he is hearing. His wandering finally draws him towards an old man, his wife, as well as their daughter, and it looked to Susano that the parents were actually weeping for their daughter. But at that moment in time, he obviously did not know why. And so he goes up to them and asks, "Why ever do you mourn?" And so, the old man looking at the deity before him, he replies saying that his name was Ashinadzushi, and that he was an earth deity, and that his wife was called Tenadzushi. He then points to his daughter and says, "This is my daughter, Kushinada Hime, and it is for her that we do weep." Once upon a time, we did in fact have many daughters. We actually had 8. But every year there is a dragon known as Yamata no Orochi, which comes forth to devour one of our daughters. Kushinada Hime is our final daughter, and we don't want to lose her to this dragon.
We had 8 daughters. We lost 7, but it's this 8th one we really got to keep. So what happened? Like that shouldn't this have been an issue prior to losing 7 other daughters? One would wonder.
I would hope that in this case it was, but I guess as well for those other 7, there was no one around to save the day.
Hmm.
So their desperation couldn't be felt by anyone else at the time, perhaps.
But you would think a deity would have some sort of deity support system or network to be able to contact other deities to get assistance, but I guess perhaps not.
Perhaps not. I think you're right there. Or as ever, we can come back to the whole thing of when you're looking into myths and legends like this, you just kind of got to roll with it at times, I find.
Okay, rolling.
But we'll also see that later on as well, I think, in
Mm.
this story. Now, Susano, he starts racking his mind, thinking, however can I help to save this girl? And in the end, he asks them to hand over their daughter to him. They agree to this, and Susano, it appears, does have some kind of magical powers to him, and he turns the girl into a many toothed comb, which he then places in his hair. And so he disguises her as a comb to hide her from the dragon which is about to come. After he had done this, he then talks to the old couple again and asks them to brew 8 giant vats of sake for him and have them ready for the appearance of Yamato no Orochi. And so they all wait together, and eventually the dragon does appear. Now, from the description of the dragon, it is always the same, and it does have some reminiscence of the Hydra from the Greek myths, in that it wasn't a dragon with one head, but it was actually a dragon with 8 heads. And this goes back to the whole inconsistencies with myths and legends I think we've mentioned. And it seems that Susano seems to obviously he's met these 2 people for the first time, and he's also heard about this dragon, you would assume, for the first time. However, from what he tells them to do with the sake, it appears that he instantly has a knowledge that he will be facing a monster which has 8 separate heads. And another thing that I thought about is that obviously we've had a few episodes now where we've had dragon tales, or at the very least we've mentioned dragons, and that at least in these Shinto myths where it's supposed to be showing you how the world and everything was created, there is actually no origin point to dragons mentioned in them.
Oh.
Unlike Greek myths and things, you can always find where creatures are descended from or what their lineage is, but with Shinto, there doesn't seem to be this. The only deity we have talked about before, which has links to creature creation, I suppose, was Ukemochi all the way from episode 12.
Oh,
But
wow.
in that one, she was only described as making things with either fins, so creatures of the sea,
Yeah.
or she made creatures of rough and fine hair, so presumably mammals. There is no mention of her creating animals with scales, for instance.
Hmm.
And so, again, we have no real origin stories for this, but there are many dragons associated with the myths and legends and folk tales of Japanese history.
Could it be something, or I mean, from my rudimentary and basic knowledge, that Legends of Dragons came from like Chinese mythology. So maybe it was perhaps something that just kind of was like had the origins in Chinese mythology, and maybe they were just brought in to these legends as well, just not really giving an origin, just because the understanding that they are there, that it came from another mythology.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I'm trying to think as well. These stories were ordered to be compiled by an empress at the time,
Hmm.
basically to bring all of these myths and legends together to make a cohesive narrative,
Mm.
to, for one, legitimize the reign of the emperors by linking them to the sun goddess, but also by bringing together all the myths to show how Japan itself was created. So, if there was beliefs of them coming from China, I suppose it would make sense that they did not include that part of the story because they were trying to create a narrative which showed how purely Japan was made.
Hmm.
So, I see where you're coming from there.
Thank you. Now back to the story.
So the dragon has finally appeared. Like we've said, it's a giant 8-headed beast, but it also has an 8-forked tail and eyes that shone bright red. Such was the size of this dragon, trees actually grew upon its back, and its body was so long that it completely covered 8 hills and valleys simultaneously. Now, they were fortunate enough that Susano had actually been right. Apparently, this dragon did have a great liking for sake, and so it dipped each and every one of its heads into the large vats that it came across and drank its fill until eventually it fell asleep. And I suppose by this point it was too inebriated to remember the reason it was actually here, which was obviously for the girl. And so as the dragon slept, that is when Susanoo then took up his 10-span sword, which was known as, well, one of the names it is known to have gone by is Orochi no Aramasa, which can be broken up into 3 words of like serpent, rough, and true. And using the sword, he began to behead the creature. But he did not just stop there, and he decided to proceed to cut the rest of the body of the dragon into very small pieces until he eventually worked his way down to its tail, in which he made an interesting discovery. As he was making one more slice into the dragon, he pulled his sword out to find that it was now dented. This made him grow curious, and so he decided to open up the tail to see what had caused such damage. And this is when he found another sword inside the tail of the dragon. Now, this is a sword which became known as kusanagi, or sometimes it's also known as murakumo, these meaning either grass mower or assembled clouds, respectively. It's said that when Susano found this sword, he recognized it as a divine sword. Perhaps quite rightly, as he had been exiled from heaven, he decided it was not for him to keep due to its divinity. And so it said that he gave it up to the deities of heaven. Now, he's been expelled from heaven, so don't ask me how he got it to these gods and goddesses. But nonetheless, somehow this sword makes its way back into heaven. And if you know about Japan and the idea of the sacred regalia for the royal family of the sword, the mirror, and the jewel, this is the sword that makes up those 3 sacred items.
Oh. So what were the 3 sacred items again? That is.
So the imperial family has 3 sacred objects, which has been with their family apparently for, well, since the very first emperor. One is a sacred sword, which is this sword, which was found in the dragon. There is also a mirror, and there is also a sacred jewel, which is the same shape as the comma-shaped beads, which were known as the magatama. Now, I won't say too much more about those 3 items. I am planning right now an episode where I want to tell the history of each item, like where it went through history and where it is today. But yes, as to the origins of that specific sword, it was found inside of a dragon, at least according to the legends anyway. And so after this, after Susano's brave endeavors, he decides to go on and settle in a place known as Suga in Izumo province. And at the same time, he decides to marry the woman that he has saved. He then composed a poem which went as follows. Yakumo tatsu, Izumo yahegaki, tsumagome ni, yahegaki tsukuru, sono yahegaki o. Which we can translate to many clouds arise on all sides of the manifold fence, to receive within it the spouses. They form a manifold fence. Ah, a manifold fence. Now, I'm going to ask Heather for her interpretation of this because to me it sounds like a very, very strange poem.
So the first thing that pops out at me is word tsuma. I am a tsuma. So
Okay.
Wife. So you have like a oto or shujin and tsuma. There's another word for wife too. So I'm surprised that they said spouses versus wife for the translation. So I'm interested in that. Yahigaki. I feel like that's a I'm not sure there's quite a few words that I'm not familiar with, but
Going back to you saying, oh, it's interesting that they used spouses as a translation, the book that most people draw their notes and their research for the Nihongi, they normally go to a book which was translated by a man known as W.G. Aston, and he translated the book all the way back in 1896. So the translation itself is also over 100 years old, which could also explain the strange choice of words for the poem in English.
Yeah, I mean, English itself has gone through quite a few changes, and actually we'll touch on that when we get to the poem section, because the translation we have is kind of in older English as well. So yeah, because the word manifold is quite old. Not too many people say manifold these days, so that would make sense. Plus, two, perhaps like some even like Japanese language has meanings and stuff have evolved a little bit over time as well, or quite a lot. So possibly those words might have been understood to mean something different, and they've just gone through the over 100 years, 100 over 150 years, I guess. The meanings may have changed too. So that's interesting.
No, I think this is one where we've actually come up in a bit of a blank due to the age of the actual English translation. Because I know most of our translations for last year were modern books, or at least books from the last 10 years.
Yeah, I think I will consult with the professor on this one to see if he is familiar with this poem, and if maybe we can find the kanji for it. Might be really interesting to look up.
So after he has composed his, let's say, lovely poem, I'm sure it was lovely in the original Japanese.
Hmm.
So he's composed his lovely poem, and then after some time, he and his new wife do come together and they produce a new deity known as Ohonamochi. To the parents of his wife, he then bestowed upon them the titles of palace masters, and this title was basically for them to be the masters of the palace, which was created for Susano-o's son, Oho Namochi. And after all of this, he's saved the woman, he's married the woman, he has a child now. Susanoo then finally, I feel like we've been saying this for a long time, he finally proceeded to Yomi to be united with his mother Izanami once and for all. Because if we remember all these times ago, every time he's complained, it's like, I want to go meet my mother. But first, I need to go say bye to my sister. Okay, I need to go see my mother now. But first, I'm going to ruin heaven for everyone. Oh, I've been exiled. I need to go see my mother. But first, let me just get married and have a kid. So it's been a lot of postponement, at least for Susano, but he has finally achieved the original goal. I feel like it's when you play a video game and you do all the side quests instead of the main mission. That's basically what he was doing with his life.
The way you put that, I don't think I can improve upon that, because that is, yeah, he side quested. Yeah, because that's how this whole thing started, was to be reunited with his mother, and that was what, last year. Oh my gosh, that was over a year ago that we even talked about this. I had completely forgotten until you had mentioned that last line. I went, oh, rather interesting, almost like a growing up story where you have goes out on a journey, and almost like a re- redemptive in a way. He grew up and he matured, and then he finally, once he was able to mature, then he could reach his goal.
I like that interpretation, actually. Yeah, because I suppose this very last section of his story is very different to all the characteristics we have seen for him so far. Like,
Yes, this
he's
is.
only ever been angry and childish and very destructive in how he acts. And, like, he didn't seem to care about anything. Like, obviously, he said, I have to go say goodbye to my sister, but then it was almost like that was just a lie because he wanted to go and cause a bit more havoc because he knew he could. But
Mm.
whereas this part, it's a complete no, not 360, because that would mean he's gone back to being the same. It's a complete 180.
Yeah, because when you first started telling the story, I'm like, this doesn't sound like Susano. Is this the same Susano? Are you sure it's the same Susano? But if we think about it in that terms, and then I guess too, to compile the stories, to have it, like, if you're going to tie it back to like a sacred object, the fact that he wasn't able to get the sacred object until he almost in a sense redeemed himself by helping out someone else and saving the woman. He had to, in order to get this particular item, he had to show how kind of bad he was, and then how he changed and matured and was willing to help others, and then that's when he was able to get a sacred item, which was then very important for Japan's history.
So in a way, it's like that is his proof of redemption.
I'm not sure if that's what the writer intended, but that's perhaps maybe through the lens of our own cultural perspectives. I guess having kind of like a
Mm.
what's it called, like a hero's journey, I guess, where, yeah, like a hero's journey story. So that's just kind of going through how we are looking at it through Western culture versus looking at it through, at least that's it. So I'm trying to figure out how to say this in a intelligent, culturally respectful way. I mean, we are looking at these stories because we grew up in a Western perspective, a Western culture, and we have the ideas of the stories, which do share some similarities, but because these stories are from a like Japanese perspective, the meanings might be different in Japanese versus the way we're looking at them, which is we're interpreting them as coming from, our particular culture and the way our stories and everything that we were taught.
Yeah, I suppose there is, due to the, I don't want to say cultural divide, that seems like the wrong term, but I think you know what I mean. To us, a story, it goes back to the time when we did the poem about the samurai, when I had a certain interpretation based
Hmm.
on how we see things from an English perspective, but then the professor actually told us, actually, it means this from our cultural perspective, which was almost the complete opposite of what I
Hmm.
was thinking.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, our knowledge base too. We as we explore more, we learn more, and we can go back. I'd love to come back to this particular story, or just Susanoo. I'd love to come back to Susanoo like later on and come back and listen to this, like learn the story again and listen to it once we've gotten more information, just to kind of see the understanding. And it could be, we might be actually onto something, because there is something like interesting. I've seen that there. I mean, you've seen too. You've noticed that there are similarities within the way some stories are told or shared.
Hello, Mr. Crow in the background, ruining our audio.
I think he's trying to tell me something, but I can't speak Crow. There's a lot of similarities in cultures as well. So, I mean, there are some similarities, but there are some differences too. So, I think the fact that we could be on the right track, because there are some similarities within cultures too. There are differences. And as the more we
Don't
study,
worry, carry on. I'm trying to ignore the crow.
I
It's
know
just,
I'm trying really hard to.
oh my god.
I
First
totally,
episode of year 2, and it's a hot mess because of a crow.
we're just wanting to call back to episode 1.
Go back to episode 1, a hot mess.
This one's a more lukewarm mess. Okay, where was I going? I didn't even know where I was going. You might just want to cut that whole bit out, because I was basically trying to say that there are a lot of similarities between culture and like stories that are shared amongst cultures, but they do have some differences. And it's worth the fact that we are studying them, and we are studying them kind of from our perspective, but to try to, as much as possible, we do try to get things more from like the Japanese perspective. We do try to consult with like native Japanese speakers and Japanese people, as well as people who've studied Japanese extensively, to try to not compensate, but try to make sure that we give them as much understanding as possible. And I think I'm just going to have to stop because I'm distracted by the crow.
Thank you, Mr. Crow, for ruining whatever was on Heather's mind. I'm sure it would have been. Oh, yeah, there he goes again. So I'm going to round it out with a little bit extra about the stories. So, like I said before, with these myths, there are always several versions of the tales. Even in the Nihongi itself, it is a document compiled of, here is the main story. However, as an addendum, in one version it goes like this, or in another version it goes like this. So it can get complicated. And in some of these versions, the names of the gods do change. But the one I do quickly want to mention is I came across one where he finds the old man and the woman grieving for their daughter. However, at the time, the mother was still pregnant. And she tells Susano that every time she gives birth to a new daughter, this is when Yamato no Orochi appears to then take their child from them. And as she is close to term, they fear they will soon happen again. In this version of the story, she does eventually give birth. Like, Susanoo stays with them until it happens, and that is when the dragon does come. And just as he's about to eat this newborn child, Susanoo actually jumps in to talk to the creature. Susanoo confronts him and basically says, "Oh dear, you're such an awful deity. But because you're so awful, I dare not neglect to give you a feast." And so he actually proceeds to pour the sake himself into the creature's 8 different mouths until the creature becomes so drunk that he falls asleep. And that is when he then cuts the creature once more into 8 different pieces. So I wanted to just mention that version because whereas a lot of the others were quite similar, this is quite different in that he's protecting a newborn child
Mm.
as opposed to a full-grown woman, which I kind of liked.
So this version is the end of the story. Did he find the sword once he chopped Yamato no Orochi, or did he this particular version just ends with him being chopped to pieces?
Oh no, the rest of the story continues in much of the similar vein, which is why I didn't
Ah,
say that part of the story again. It does continue. He does cut up the dragon. He does find the sword still.
does he still marry the girl?
Once she's grown up, yes.
Hmm. Okay. Well, at least when she's grown up, that's.
That's something.
I mean, if you look at the previous version, so they had once had 8. I mean, even technically, do they have 8 all at one time, or do they have one daughter get eaten, have another daughter get eaten? So we don't even know like if it was all 8 at one time, or if it was kind of this similar story. So this one, it was have a daughter gets eaten, have another daughter, the daughter gets eaten. So I mean, I guess we don't know if they were like the daughters were all at the same time, or if it was just one at a time.
No, I think from what I was reading that yeah, in this version it was they would have a child, the dragon would come. They would have another child, the dragon would come. And for what I assumed in the other version was they once had 8 daughters, and then once a year the dragon would come and take a random one of them.
So the daughters themselves were all deities as well. Then I guess, correct?
Presumably so, yeah. They were daughters of 2 deities. I'm not sure if his mother was a deity, only the father calls himself an earth deity.
Okay.
However, they do have similar names, so I am assuming she is also a deity of some form, so all of their daughters would also have been.
So Thomas, with this tale being told, do we now leave Susano or do we come back to Susano?
That is actually the last time he will appear as at least a main character in these stories. I don't recall ever seeing him again in the events that happen after this.
Ah.
So if you were growing attached to him, Heather, or anyone at home, time to say your goodbyes.
Well, I wasn't growing so much attached to him till this episode where he was helping instead of destroying everything.
Mm.
So, but
At least for me, that is my part of the episode done for today. I have nothing more really to say about Susano, so I will, as ever, hand it over to your literary corner.
okay, thank you so much. So, when Thomas and I were discussing the episode for this week, and we decided to delay Basho because we wanted to do more research, and we both thought that, like he said, we wanted to make sure we gave Basho the proper respect as much as we are able to at this point in our research. We'll try our best. We want to probably will need to come back to Basho, like Hokusai. We'll have to come back to Basho in the future because there's just so much information. Well, Thomas told me the story he wanted to tell, and it had a dragon. So I was like, oh, I'm going to go look for a dragon poem. There must be a dragon poem. And so I did a search, and I don't know how I got from dragon to dragonfly. And interestingly enough, with dragonfly, I also got to Basho. And one of the websites I encountered had a poem and also referenced Lefcadia Hearn's book, Japanese Miscellany. And I know Thomas had recently bought a Lefcadia Hearn book and asked him, like, oh, Thomas, let's check the library. Which one did you get? And he pulls up a book and he's got another Basho poem, except this one's about butterflies. All that little roundabout way to say we're going to do a Basho poem today, and it's not about dragons or dragonflies, but it is about butterfly. So tangential journey to get to Basho.
I think it's just a sign that we are inevitably working towards his episode. Wherever we look, his head pops up once more.
I hope he would enjoy the fact that we keep encountering him wherever we go. So, with that background out of the way, I'm not going to talk about Basho today because we've mentioned him before, and we're going to have a whole episode on him. But I will say that the dragonfly poem that I saw, I definitely want to include that in next week's. But this one was just really cute and joyous and happy, and so I wanted to use it today. And Thomas, although you We're the kind provider of the text, which is from Lefcadia Hearn's book. Which book is this that we are pulling from?
The book that I got this from was from Kwaidan, Stories and Studies of Strange Things.
Thank you so much, Thomas. As I was going around exploring everything, and we ended up back in the live. So your virtual, for me, virtual library, your physical library, but for me, virtually. So although you know the translation, but I'll go ahead and see. I'll test your memory.
Okay.
Oki oki yo, waga tomo nisen, neru kocho.
From what I can remember when I looked at this before we started recording, the oki is being used as a shortening of okiru, so like to get up or to wake up, I assume. The yo in Japanese context, is that more to emphasize a point?
Yeah.
So oki, so get up, but yo is like no, get up kind of thing. Wagotomo ni sen, I cannot remember actually, so you'll have to enlighten me. But the neru kocho, neru is like the verb for to sleep. Kocho, I don't know what butterfly is in Japanese, but I feel that this
Chocho.
chocho. Oh, so this is calling it a little butterfly because it's not chocho, it's kocho.
That is a really good question and a really good observation because I was wondering why kocho, because kocho is like a word for boss, or you went kocho sensei, which is the like principal. So I like your thinking, and I wish I could see the kanji for this so that I could know for sure.
I'm going to guess maybe it is because, yeah, neru chocho, or no, it wouldn't be a pun because they wouldn't work in that extent.
No, but I like your idea, like small butterfly. I think that to me that makes that I could see some logic.
Because as well, he would need to do something with the chocho to make it fit into the 575
Hmm.
of the poem as it needed to be. And I suppose small butterfly would have fit the bill nicely.
Hmm. What do you think, if you can recall? What do you think this poem means?
Well, I would need you to remind me what the second line of the poem is, because that was the section that I couldn't recall.
So I think the tomo, if I had to guess, is like friend. But waga tomo. I mean, I know wagamama means selfish, but waga tomo, I'm not familiar with. And then ni, I'm assuming is the particle, and sen. I honestly don't know because I don't. It's just we only have the romanji. We don't have the kanji for this. So honestly, I'm not sure what sen means in this context at all.
Ignoring the second line, then, I am, even though I'm missing a third of the poem, I'm going to jump out on a limb and say it is something about wake up, Mr. Butterfly, it's time to wake up.
Also, I just did a quick dictionary search, and Thomas, you are my wagatomo.
Selfish friend, how dare you?
No! No!
So what does wagatomo mean?
According to Google Sensei, it means my friend.
Okay. So wake up, my special friend. Special friend, did you say, sorry? No. My best friend, close friend. What did you say?
My friend.
Okay. So wake up, my friend, the sleeping butterfly. So he's calling the butterfly his friend.
I'm going to read because this is a direct translation. This is from Lefcadia Hearn, which was what early 1900s. This book was published originally.
January 20th, 1904.
Yeah, so this is over 100 years old now. This is the translation that Lefcadia Hearn gave, and I'm going to read this direct translation again, noticing the time frame of when it was done. Wake up, wake up. I will make thee my comrade, thou sleeping butterfly.
Now that you've reread that, I remember that from before we started recording, and
Mm.
I did think the idea of comrade was a strange word to use. I was thinking, oh, are they using some kind of military term, which didn't make sense with the butterfly? But now that you said the wagatomo is my friend, back then it was more common to call someone a comrade instead of a friend. So I understand now what you were saying when we did the first poem with the it's interesting to see the change and we'll see it later. And I definitely see that now here.
Yeah, I mean, ordinarily now we probably would not use that term. And also, it is not very common to use thou anymore, as far as I'm aware. I've not used it in everyday life, unless if I read a Bible verse, I might, King James version, I might use some thous or some Shakespeare. So I mean, I like this translation just because of we've got the history, like the changing of English and how Japanese poems were translated in the early 1900s versus how they are translated now. So I'd love to find a more modern translation of this poem, and I'm hoping to hunt for that. But according to Lefcadia Hearn, this poem is to suggest the joyous feeling of springtime. So I guess you see a butterfly out, like, let's be friends, butterfly. Although I guess if it's like on a flower, just kind of like resting and just kind of, I guess, getting nectar. He wants to wake up and be friends and enjoy the lovely warm spring weather.
It's a very cute poem, to be sure.
Yeah, and when you shared it, I was like, oh yeah, I need to read that. That is very good. Now we also know a new term in Japanese, so I'm very excited to learn more Japanese too.
Yeah, that was pretty good today. Unexpected new word. Well, I always say this, but thank you so much for the poem today. It was a good find by both of us. We stumbled across it last minute and it worked really well for today's episode.
I was super excited.
So so thank you, my comrade Heather, for wanting to include it today.
誠もありがとうございました。
So with that, I suppose we are done for our first episode into year 2. We hope you enjoyed it. A callback to episode 1. We stuck with Shinto, and Basho will be next week. Thank you again for us reaching 100 listeners.
Yay!
Finally, we've hit the 3-digit number. And again, thank you for your continued listenership week in and week out. We really do appreciate it. But with that, I suppose I don't need to say what next week is. We've said it many times already now. Anything else from you today, Heather, or not?
I think today I'm all set. Really happy to be back recording. Happy to be back recording. Yay!
So nice to be recording again. Does the crow have anything left to say before we sign off? He's been quiet for a while now. Just ruined all that other recording for us. No, I think
Yeah,
he's
he's
good.
got nothing else to say. Yeah, no. Now we need him to talk. He won't talk. That's okay.
Well, anyway, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. Don't forget, you can leave us a review over on Podchaser, on iTunes, and as well, wherever you listen to our podcast. Any likes, ratings, and review definitely will help us find new listeners. I want to say thank you to the 2 people who gave us the ratings on iTunes. Whoever you are, thank you so much. We do appreciate that. Be sure to follow us on social media. We're on Twitter and Facebook at Japan Archives. And if you want to follow us on Instagram, you can follow mine, which is Nexus Travels. That's NEXUS_travels. Anything else, Heather?
And Thomas, I would like to just mention that recently, due to your episode on Hokusai, that Hokusai gave me a little bit of inspiration to do a little bit of changing on my website. So my website has gotten some updates and some changes and a bit of a refresh. I guess refresh is the right thing to say. I've updated the website, and it is kind of more following the little slices of life in Japan, along with some photography. And it is heatheroveryonder.com.
So yeah, if you're interested in some little slices of life over in Japan, be sure to check that out. If you do want to check out our show notes for the episodes, as well as looking into some more research that we've undertaken into Japanese history, be sure to head on over to japanarchivespodcast.com. So once again, guys, thank you so much for tuning in this week, and we will see you next week. Mata ne!
皆さん気をつけて、またね。